Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Soundbite. Today we're very pleased to have Professor David Tuckett giving the Soundbite. Can I just remind you all that it's 18 minutes of provocation followed by 10 minutes of discussion, so get your questions ready now, or be ready to ask a question when you have the talk. Professor Tuckett is Professor and Director of the Centre for the Study of Decision-Making Uncertainty at UCL, and we're very pleased to have him here to talk about what is a sustainable state of mind. David, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Henrietta. So nice to be here. I've never talked on this subject before, so I hope it's interesting, coherent. I suppose the first provocation is my background, because I am a psychoanalyst, which is, UCL is unusual actually in having a number of psychoanalysts, even a psychoanalytic unit, but that's pretty unusual in the whole world. I'm also an economist and a sociologist, and we work in the Centre for Decision-Making Uncertainty with computer scientists, neuroscientists, and all kinds of things. So it's very much an interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary effort. And what's really one of the key things I want to talk to you about, because one of the key problems about sustainability is trying to avoid the problem of sustainability in mental terms, is trying to avoid the problem of mental silos in which you're busy thinking in one thing and completely disconnected from the other. This, of course, is one of the most interesting things if you study economics that we discovered. So I want to make the case that a sustainable state of mind is essentially a homeostatically balanced reality state. So what do I mean by that lot of jargon? Well, homeostasis, you may or may not be aware of, is a medical concept. And it's a concept about the way the body manages itself to essentially survive. Your body is managing all the various functions to keep you going, right? And if things get out of balance, you soon cease to function. So illness, for example, puts people out of balance, so can various other things like not having the right diet, etc., etc. And the human organism is extremely subtly and finely adapted to its environment and to maintaining its environment. You could argue one of the big things about human beings is that we developed a brain and so forth, which, well, you say we developed, we happen to have one, but it developed through evolution. And this gives us a lot of opportunity to alter our environment, supposedly for the better. So by analogy, I want you to think of a sustainable state of mind is a mental thing, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it is very much part of and attached to the body. So that's the second provocation. Just forget Descartes. No, don't forget Descartes, but forget simplistic notions that the body and the mind are separate. They're not. The mind, the brain, was developed in order to support the body and in order to give the body a better opportunity to survive, better opportunity to reproduce, and so forth. So we're therefore talking about a sustainability would require a sustainable state of the body as well as the mind. The crucial role or the crucial link here are emotions. Again, you may or may not find this a provocative topic, but as you know, emotions were essentially removed from academic discourse, at least in the social sciences and a number of other sciences, and really also even in psychology and neuroscience for a long time. And in fact, there's a paper published only a few weeks ago in the Annual Review of Psychology, which is a very top journal in psychology, which is arguing that in just the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a paradigm shift in psychology towards an awareness of the vital role of emotion in everything, right? So, in other words, we now have concepts, well, I'm not anticipating what I'm saying, but so why is emotion important? And that is because the emotions are built into body states. So, for example, mental pain and physical pain are very closely connected. When you have emotions, if you put you into a scanner we can see that things are happening in the so-called more primitive parts of the brain, the amygdala and places like that, which are part of the animal function. Right? So you actually can't even think without this part of the brain lighting up and coming into operation. So at the basic level, emotions, which are supported by all kinds of chemical systems and hormone systems and so on, are fundamental to our well-being. And we can talk about a number of emotions, but I like to talk about two critical ones. One is the emotions that go with attachment, which are to do with excitement and to do with the seeking of pleasure and the experience of pleasure. The other are the emotions to do with anxiety, which are essentially to do with running away. We can see why the organism needed a very efficient system for both these things. You need to run away fast if you, for example, are in the African savannah where you come from, or in the jungle, or wherever, right? And so, of course, all of this is taken over from animal evolution into humans, but then based on, in the body, that when we feel fear, that is a physical experience and not just a mental experience. So emotions are dominating. And the key point here that I want to provoke you with is that emotions are a resource. So, you know, the standard idea that men are rational, isn't it wonderful, and women are irrational, and oh dear, what a problem, right? Or a great deal of stuff about rationality in decision-making, in economics, in politics, and so on. I would tell you this, that anyone who's making decisions, who tells me they do it only on rationality, I would take, if I could, the power to make decisions away from them. First, because they're not. And secondly, if they think they are, that means they're ignoring something. Okay? So the fundamental point is that emotions are a resource. And the key idea, well, I can't remember what I'm going to say. So yeah, so they're a key in terms of establishing and maintaining relationships and attachment process. You know what attachment is? That is from the very early development in the human being, the human baby. There are all kinds of very powerful attachment processes that attach the parents to the babies and the babies to the parents, operating at very primitive levels. You have no idea they're going on. Well, these are at the heart of when you get excited and when you form relationships. Also want to think of most thinking is expressed actually in terms of relationships, connections between ideas. And these are very, I mean, if you're doing pure mathematics, you can argue that maybe emotion is not there. Though Rickard at the back, there's a pure mathematician, might well actually say, well, actually, there's an aesthetic to mathematics. So it's not always quite so clear-cut even though. But clearly, mathematics is a language which tries to have its own absolute language. But nearly everything else, theories feel right. They tend to, ultimately. It could be I don't mean that that's the only criteria for a theory, definitely not. But ultimately, it's the feeling right that's really quite important. So in a sustainable world, we require proper relationships to the body, proper relationships to emotions. Relationships are very much part of maintaining homeostatic reality in the world, and so are attachment processes, and so are location in communities and in cooperation. Again, the human being developed there on the African plains, we believe, in cooperative ventures. And there's all kinds of work showing that this capacity for cooperation is fundamental, which means that models of humans, or models of, shall we say, how are we going to combat climate change or something, which are based on atomistic actors who have no relationship to other, don't think about other people's minds and so on, is a fundamental problem of a way to go. And one other point I just wanted to make, just to go back, is that when I talk about reality, okay, we all know, if we have any kind of sophistication from the social sciences or philosophy, that what is reality is a complex problem. This tends to be not altogether recognized sometimes in the physical sciences, where people think, no, this is it. But actually, reality is always something perceived. So even our concepts of physics and so on are currently based inside theories and assumptions. The one thing we know is that this context for those will probably change as people have greater understanding later in time. So when I talk about reality, I mean that, that a sustainable state of mind has to be orientated towards reality, but I don't have a simple view of what reality is. Now, the fundamental state of the world, I want to argue to you, is one of deep uncertainty and unforeseen consequences. And if anything, this is my... We've lost the slides. I've got them. You haven't. So I just got so you should be seeing something which says the fundamental state of the world is one of deep uncertainty and unforeseen consequences. So as you know, if for example you're interested in statistics, or all statistics is based on a very simple proposition which is often hidden. It is that the information we have now, which of course is produced by dynamics, right? Dynamics, it could be the physical laws of the universe, it could be the medical laws, it could be the social, whatever. But the statistics we have now are contained within them the dynamics of a situation. In order to predict or say something with statistics about what's going to happen, we actually have to make assumptions about future event spaces in which to do probability and so on. But these event spaces, when we make them, we make an assumption that something about dynamics is not shifting. Now, if you're looking down at the world from Mars or from the moon, the one thing you would not think is that this is an equilibrium state we're in. You would notice that an awful lot of change has been going on, even in our lifetimes, let alone in longer time periods. So the key point is that whilst there is a value to creating theories about decision-making and so on based on the proper use of information we have now, there's always an element of, well, perhaps the information we have now is actually, the more of it we have and the better we distribute it using statistical methods, the more inaccurate our future judgments of what's going to happen will be. Because by definition, statistics are dominated by the dynamics of the past. And I was at a meeting on Tuesday where this was made clear. For example, most of you won't be old enough to know, but in London, about 30 years ago, there were 1 million manual workers, mostly doing manual manufacturing jobs, mostly around the North and South Circular, actually mostly around the North Circular. Today there are 0. Those people used to, and it was all designed like that, is to live near their work. That's why they were there, that's why the factories were there. So what happened? Well, those 1 million people now come in to central London for jobs. They've on the whole found jobs, but the transport system had to find 1 million extra journeys a day. And you can now look, if you get the Oyster card and you project it onto a map and so on, you can see those journeys in red beautifully coming down the tube lines and so on. Why was it possible? Well, it's actually possible because the tube had been built with spare capacity. Right? A lot of spare capacity, which even now it may have spare capacity. When they were arguing whether to extend the Jubilee line, which, you know, that little bit that goes out to East London, there was a huge argument about whether it was really necessary and great concern about, you know, building a tube line that was not actually going to be used. Well, it's now absolutely fully used. But it would not have, none of this would have been fully used by the mathematical models that planners were using 30 years ago, right? Because the dynamics and the understanding of the society they were trying to plan were not known. So a sustainable state of mind has to take into account the fact that the world is full of deep uncertainty and unforeseen consequences. And that the crucial issue is how we manage uncertainty. This, of course, has long been an issue of interest to sociologists and social anthropologists. It's no accident, I'm sure, that Henrietta is in charge of the Sustainability Institute, because this is the everyday stuff, especially in anthropology, but also in sociology, where there's an interest in understanding not how the world is in equilibrium on the whole. There was an interest in that a bit 50 or 60 years ago, but much more, how does the world manage to get order at all, right? But given the tendency for constant uncertainty. Psychoanalysis, which I'm interested in, is also critically concerned with uncertainty all the time. And that is because psychoanalysts are interested in the way we manage as human beings core conflicts, which Freud began to write about and were written about subsequently. The one thing that more nonsense is talked about than anything else is psychoanalysis, by the way. But so the core conflicts about which humans all face, and you know you face them if you think about them for 5 minutes, are roughly these. The conflicts around omnipotence, that is, around the feeling that I can do what I like. And that means I am able to do what I'm like in all senses of the word able. Actually, as you know, if you have to deal with small children, this is something that has to be dealt with, and they have to learn how to do it. And you have to learn, like if you come to UCL, you have to learn how to put your skills to work to try to achieve what you want. And that's, as we know, work, which requires a certain mental state of mind. So managing conflicts around omnipotence is fundamental, and you only have to look at the newspapers to see that we're often not doing too well. Because, for example, my omnipotence might clash with Henrietta's. And that means we've got a conflict to resolve. And these are non-trivial problems. Another set of conflicts are the conflicts between the generations. The small, the children wishing to take the place of the parents, or having ideas about it, or as Freud called it, the Oedipal complex. It's been written about in literature. It's an endless theme in all and many, many forms. And of course, it's a fundamental issue in sustainability, that what we use of the environment now, what will be the effect on future generations? Now, some people take the view, oh, well, we don't need to worry about that because there'll be technical progress and they'll solve their problem. So we can spend as much as we like, and we can use up as much of the commons and everything else as we like. So again, you can see that conflict between the generations is going to be a major issue, how it's resolved for sustainability. And just to stress that the psychoanalytic view is these are never resolved, right? These are managed, but never resolved. So that jealousy, envy, these kind of feelings are very highly operational all the time and have to be managed. And the final one, conflict between love and hate. That is, you may hate and love someone, and what do you do about that? Now, conviction narrative theory, which is what we've developed at the Center for the Study of Decision-Making Uncertainty, is a theory, a multidisciplinary theory, about how decisions are made under uncertainty. And it departs from most other decision-making theories, particularly in economics, but also in management science on the whole, and also in judgment decision-making in psychology. It departs because most of those theories are based around the idea that what people have been trying to do for at least 60 years is to look carefully at how do people make the correct decision. Or actually what they're more interested in is how do people make the wrong decision. But you can't have a concept of the wrong decision unless you've got a concept of the correct decision. So many of you will have heard of, for example, Daniel Kahneman, very popular book. And all his experiments, and it's very interesting and brilliant work, are all about putting a bunch of you in an experimental situation, defining the situation so that there's a correct answer, giving you a task, and watching at least half of you fail, and then trying to understand that failure. Now, this work is extremely valuable for any situation where we do genuinely think there is a correct answer. So there is a correct answer, at least arguably, to how to bet if someone's throwing the dice all the time. or there is a correct answer for how to deal with lottery problems. And of course, most amazingly, most decision-making theory is conducted on exactly these kind of problems. These bear no relationship to the problems that the Institute of Global Sustainability is trying to deal with, nor that I'm trying to deal with, nor with the problem of should we or shouldn't we build HS2, how do we deal with the climate and environment, how do we manage financial instability, or indeed, if you're head of a large company, should you or shouldn't you invest in this, that, or the other project. None of those problems can be resolved by the type of laboratory-based finding the correct decision. So the problem of bias, for example, is a difficulty if you don't accept there's a correct decision. So that, for instance, if I have an extremely clear, I suppose I'm provost of UCL, and I've got a very clear idea that we are going to move UCL up to wherever, and this is how it's going to be done, and this is all the advantages that are going to come from it, and blah, blah. I'll create a narrative about all that, and if I can get you all interested enough in it, and manage to get other people to put up the money and so forth, we'll do it. But heavens knows if it's the right decision. That won't be known for years. Also, probably never really know, because what if we'd gone to South London or Australia? So you see what I mean, that most real decisions cannot be understood in terms of something like optimism, bias, etc. And this is why in those other theories also, emotions are seen as a complete problem. Because effectively, a human is reduced in such theories to a computational machine that knows how to do good statistics. Now, this is a very useful thing to have, to know, but it's not particularly useful for this problem. Instead, there are all kinds of theories now, which I mentioned in the paper, the new paper at Emotion, notions of embodied cognition, that cognition isn't, you know, an Aristotelian exercise in logic. It's something inherently tied to the creation of narrative in one's mind, bringing things together, the creation of feelings about that, and the picking up of different ideas and so forth that seem right. So we might want to think about, after all, that sustainable and unsustainable decision-making, because clearly, just because I'm saying that the basic problem is not how do people make the correct decisions, but how do people manage to make decisions when there's uncertainty at all. If you were given the job of being Prime Minister and you've got to decide, for example, what are we going to do about floods? Right? There were a lot of floods last year here in the UK. What are we going to do about them? Now, your scientists will probably tell you that quite a few of the houses in various parts of the UK, certainly in rural areas, are indefensible. That is to say, it's just a matter of time before they will be flooded. Well, you've got to deal with that problem at the same time as knowing exactly what happens if you're a Conservative MP for so-and-so and so-and-so in these rural areas and what people are going to say. So these are complicated decisions, and all we can expect people to do is to try to assemble their facts, try to assemble a narrative that takes people with them and that people believe in. And then what we need to think about is, well, under what conditions can such narrative, conviction narrative decision-making go wrong? And here we introduce something called Phantastic object theory. So I became interested in all this, or became interested in economics, because I was sitting over in my office in Torrington Place one day, and Peter Fonagy and I had started for a charity an electronic publishing operation that took all the journals in psychoanalysis, put them on a CD, and allowed people to search and do things, and it was quite a lot of success. And other people had put money into it, and we were kind of looking after it. But some guys came through the door who were extremely experienced and successful in very nice suits from the city, saying, this is in 1999, we want to buy it. We want to buy this company. We want to make it a .com. We want to make this the model for all academic publishing. We will give you a lot of money, actually. And you guys have to stay here and do this for the next 3 years. This is how much we're going to pay you. And we want to do it. We had a lot of discussions with them, as it was quite interesting. But we eventually said no, mainly because we could not understand how they thought this could work. And also, they didn't know anything about the internet, anything about publishing, or anything about psychoanalysis. And shortly afterwards, as you probably know, the .com. Unfortunately, we hadn't sold out to them, or probably something we'd have a difficulty seeing our stuff subsequently. Now, the interesting thing about all that, it's been studied, is if you add .com at that time, if you just started Tuckett.com, your share price would go up over the next week by up to 40%. It's a nice piece of work has done this. Despite whatever relationship there was between your activity and the internet, which most people probably didn't understand what it really was anyway. After the crash, take away .com, same effect, right? So what you're seeing there is that narratives are very powerful, but you're also seeing that the notion .com functioned as what I call a fantastic object. That's a little difficult to explain, a fantastic object, but basically it means a very compelling, and the object is in the philosophical sense, so a very compelling idea or thing or person. For example, David Beckham is certainly a fantastic object, or many people like this, many of these stars. People who get people really excited and which people have a great attraction towards, which is way, there might be lots of cognitive reasons for it, but it's way beyond that. Of course, what it's based on is the human need to make attachments, the process of what we call idealization, which is an emotional and cognitive process in psychoanalysis, which is a very useful thing. For example, not that many people would get married or have children if they performed a spreadsheet rational analysis of the costs and benefits. So you need idealization and all the hormonal effects to get going on this, right? Now, hopefully, when you've done it, real returns start developing, and go back to my state that sustainable thinking has to be based on reality. A sustainable idealized thought, say you actually have a child, they give you pleasure, they also give you a lot of grief, or same in relationships. So you gradually build a real relationship which is based on disappointment and satisfaction and some management of the two, right? But in a fantastic object, as soon as the object disappoints, that's it. And this is the sort of thing that happens, you can see clinically, with people who go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 marriages, because the trouble is no one can be Marilyn Monroe or whatever it is. Real people, they smell and they do things and they have friends and they, Okay, so fantastic object we've applied. It's a very successful concept. George Soros, for example, has applied it to the way the euro developed and became a very unrealistic concept, because now it is what tends to happen eventually to fantastic objects. It's a denigrated object. And that's a very difficult object to get back to being an ordinary, useful object. The fantastic object is fantastic objects exist. It's nothing, they exist for very good reasons. But the problem is if thinking, that is, if narratives get taken over by them under the pressure of processes like Groupfeel, Groupfeel is what you may have heard of, groupthink, except I call it Groupfeel because it's not about thinking. It's about feeling. It's about feeling I want to be part of that. And a divided state, which is a state of mind, I think I've got here, which is you can think about it as very simplistic. You can think about the way people think in two forms: a divided state, which is a very simplistic black and white state, in which the everyday anxiety-producing ideas that are thrown up by reality, for example, you get ill, are you you get some symptom, are you ill, or is this going wrong, or is that going wrong, or is my plan to come and give this lecture totally falling apart? These are feelings you have, but in a divided state, there's a division between thoughts in the mind that create anxiety and thoughts in the mind that creates, for example, excitement. So people can completely put to one side, like my friends who came to try and buy my psychoanalytic untitled.com, they put out of their mind somehow, it's not because they can't do it, they're very intelligent people, right? They somehow put out of their mind the fact that things could go wrong. And this is what I argue happened in the financial crisis, that it wasn't to do with incentives, but it's to do fundamentally with a massive belief within the financial markets that things could go on as they were, and this is a very successful way of actually doing things. So a divided state is a state where things are pushed out of the mind, whereas an integrated state, which is a much more complex state of mind in which conflict and contradiction are tolerated. See, the problem with bad news is it feels bad. So, you know, kings through the ages have shocked people who came with bad news for very good reason. They didn't like the pain. The trouble is, if the news is correct, it doesn't achieve the problem, right? But that's what a divided state does. It shoots the bad news. Whereas in an integrated state, you can tolerate the anxiety that actually we don't necessarily have a solution right now to flooding or climate change, or we have ideas about it. We have these things. We might convince ourselves that this is a way forward, but we don't forget that maybe this is actually just a narrative which we've created, which we've invested in, and that it could go wrong. So when we get bad news, we might listen to it, which might then enable us to adjust to what's going on. And the key ideas here, because I think I'm just running out of time now, is that to get to an integrated state requires coming to terms with reality, which is an emotional process. An emotional process begun in childhood with this attempt to deal with omnipotence that I talked about, and which requires something called working through. It's a similar process to if you have a failure or if someone dies, that you have to work through the process, and that includes trying to deny the process for all you're worth. If something goes wrong, you know, if you get somebody tells you, sorry, you can't do that, at first most people will tend in various ways to try and deny it, which may take the form of blaming the other person and saying, oh, they're just stopping me, I couldn't do it really. No, actually. So, and lastly, I want to just point out there's a lot of talk, especially in economics, and perhaps particularly related to sustainability or the lack of it, of concepts like greed, and you could add pillage and rape. I want to just make a distinction between desire, which motivates us all and is a fundamental thing creating excitement, and desire expressed in what I call the integrated state and desire in the divided state. So in an integrated state, my desire, for example, to win at something or to have everything goes along with my awareness of the implications of that for those who I'm defeating. Do you follow? Which I might not completely like the feeling of. So in that state, concepts like greed don't belong. Greed belongs in a divided state where I can eat everything in this room, you know, and eat all the lunch and none of you get anything, and I'm feeling fine and tough, you know. Right? So concept, you know, because there's this idea greed is good, is based on a totally false notion that greed is a motivation. It sure is. But actually desire is the motivation. And desire inside an integrated state is a sustainable state. Desire inside a divided state is not. And one of the things that we do is actually we move between these two states, because sometimes when we're quite certain about things, it may be that we have a conviction narrative, we're quite certain, we're determined, you know, we're going to become Olympic gold medalists. But in life, there's a kind of movement and a deepening between these two states, which is expressed with that equation. Thank you very much.
Right, so we have 10 minutes of questions, and whilst you're all thinking about a question, perhaps I could start with one, David. So last week I was in New York talking to bankers, and every single one of them said to me, why do you think people hate us so much? Right? In that situation, are they in a divided state or an integrated state? Where are they in this? I mean, we can understand the relationship between the financial crisis and emotion, but in this...
Well, I think in that state they are I mean, I think this is one of the things. If you remember, at the very beginning of the financial crisis, after the financial crisis, you know, they got these guys in Congress or somewhere, and they asked them, and they were all, you know, completely unrepentant. Nothing to do with me. What are you talking about? Well, that would have been a divided state. At this point, I think it is sinking in that there was a problem, and they had something to do with it. And I think that it's, you know, this is part of the problem, I think, with the financial, with the response to the financial crisis. Actually, at the end of my book, I proposed, Mervyn King signed up to this actually at the time, that what really was needed was the equivalent of what the South Africans did, the Truth and Reconciliation, whatever it was called, for finance, where you would not bother with blame. Blame is a disaster. I don't mean that sometimes people aren't to blame. And of course, under certain circumstances, something has to be done about that. But blame brought into this thing is what's happened for years. Every time there's a financial crisis, and there have been many, the key response is get hold of Henrietta, she's to blame, hang her, and on we go. Right? Actually, what we need is to address the fact that, as with the dot-com, or with the housing, you know, that this situation, everybody took part in it, nearly. Even if you didn't know you did, even if you're very young, your pension or something, or your parents' pension or house was involved in all this, right? So that the fundamental, an integrated state is to recognize the relationship to the whole situation. And that, as the Truth and Reconciliation process was brought in fact, Judge Goldstone, who I met, is very keen on these ideas. Came to the Psychoanalytic Institute to discuss them. That's a way of doing this thing called working through, in which you actually really try and find out, well, actually, how did we do it? There's a very interesting paper just been in the American Economic Review of all places, because the standard economics answer to what happened now that they've you know, it wasn't in their theories, okay, but now we're trying to be clever about it, is that, well, it's a problem of incentives, right? That the bankers had the wrong incentives. If we regulate properly and the regulators hadn't been asleep on the job, we can create their incentives so this doesn't happen. Well, you just think about that. It's not so easy to create incentives in an uncertain decision-making environment, because how do you know whether someone's doing a good job or not? I could do a whole lecture on it. But beyond that, the immediate distracting myself actually, but so that, yeah, so that the incentives. One of the things this man did is he had in the AEI had a very interesting thing. He was able to use the American tax records and things like that, and the filings, to see what the people who made these decisions invested in themselves. And what did they invest in? Their own stuff, of course. In fact, what my colleague Paul Ormerod knows somebody who got a bonus in 2007 of £10 million. What did he do with it? He invested in his own fund. What happened to his own fund? Fell to virtually nothing. What's he facing now? A tax demand, because it was an income, for £10 million that no longer exists. So, in other words, these people were very certain with their, what I would call, conviction narratives. And so a simplistic approach to it just won't work. And I think that's the underlying point, is how to get people to see this situation. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I am a historian, and I was just quite interested in sort of histories of uncertainty, and also you talk quite a lot about sort of individual states of mind and sustainable state of mind. What about sort of, is there a sustainable state of mind for communities who've perhaps had a shared history in difficulty or otherwise, but how do you kind of deal with kind of communal states of mind?
Well, that's a really good question, and that I think is the kind of thing we're interested in this institute. The short answer is I don't think anybody's done much work in it, but you can see where you can start from the kind of things I've been saying. So that, for example, the first point is never to be too simplistic. So that there's no doubt that an efficient human, a well-functioning human community needs diversity. It needs all kinds of diversity, including probably very good to have a few people in wonderful divided states completely convinced that, their approach to this and that. I mean, things like the Sydney Opera House or all the great architectural things all over, they'd never have been built by any kind of optimizing, properly well-done cost-benefit scheme. Right? So you need people to do it. And it's a kind of misunderstanding about capitalism, that capitalism is actually an extremely effective mechanism for saying no to things, much more effective than other systems like socialism, which just went on hopelessly promoting useless things. But at the same time, it does it not by choosing winners, but by creating environments, if it works, where you have a go, and the community then has a way of helping people who fall apart and getting them up and saying, "Come on, have some more ideas." I mean, so I think you would say that a sustainable community would have these kind of considerations in mind, particularly about diversity, different ways of thinking, and all that kind of thing. So once you start getting what in psychoanalysis, it's a long story, but arrogance is a state of mind, an emotional state of mind, opposite to curiosity. And a sustainable state of mind is curiosity. So when Henrietta gets the next bit of bad news about her institute, she can shout and scream. That would be normal. But after that, she could start to be curious at why those people had said no and really try and work it out rather than impose her own understanding. That's what anthropologists are trained to do, is to try and get inside. This is similar to psychoanalysis. So that's my beginning answer, but it'd be a very interesting thing to discuss further.
Do we have one more question before we start? Yeah, please.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Alex. I'm doing a PhD in economics. So I'm having a hard time to understand why uncertainty or ambiguity or risk, at least economists distinguish those things, imply lack of rationality, or should rule out rationality. Because what I think about rationality is that rationality is about one making the right decision given their likes and dislikes.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. I'm an economist. I can.
So going back to the So going back to the Sydney Opera House. So yeah, maybe comparing the benefits and the costs at that specific point in time. Maybe that opera house might have not been built, but probably the decision maker at that time was thinking about the future benefits as well, and that was probably rational.
First of all, I mean, I'm happy to talk to you at greater length because I wouldn't want to oversimplify economics. Right? But the basic point is you're talking about some form of optimization over constraints of well-stated preferences. You can't do that unless you have an event space of probabilities. What you've just discussed, a cost-benefit thing, you have to have an event space, right, against which to do your probability. You have to actually know, as you know in the Arrow de Breuer, etc., you have to have not only complete markets, but you have to be able to anticipate all future states of the world. You can't change either. Now, the underlying problem is, so in economics, you're not talking about rationality. You're talking about optimization under a set of rules, which is very easy mathematically and becomes very tractable. In real life, you don't know the event space, number one. Number two, you don't know what your observations really mean. So in economics, there's no issue of interpretation, right? So you've got facts and figures about the world, but you know what they mean. In real life, we never know what anything means. Well, that's exaggerating, but we have to interpret. So an economic actor is always omniscient in regard to the future. He's omniscient in regard to the implications of things. He's omniscient in regard to interactions. The actors are atomistic and don't take any notice of each other, except through the price mechanism, and all these things, so that you can only talk about risk in a well-defined space. So I would say that a lot of economic theory applies reasonably well to contexts such as many consumer markets that existed in the 19th century, where you've got a number of clear choices such as between soaps and detergents, but not lots of complex choices which are influenced by all kinds of other factors, such as the number of mobile phones there are today, and how in the hell does any consumer know what the differences are between them, or how long they're going to last, or all these things. So basically, the economic model was a very clever and interesting model, and it still can be used, but it's full of serious limitations. And your cost-benefit one, I would say, is fundamentally problematic. Take the discussion here about the Olympics. Right? Should we or shouldn't we do the Olympics? Is the Olympics a good thing? Well, lots of cost-benefit models saying it's, you know, because the whole thing depends on how you value all sorts of uncertainties in the situation. And one of the things nobody ever thought of, although that was present when it actually happened in London, is people felt extremely good about it, even people like my wife with no interest in sport whatsoever. And this was generally true, and this led on to new things. So the fundamental problem with uncertainty is that you cannot imagine the combinations of people and things and ideas that are coming further down the line. And therefore, you cannot create a probability distribution against which to do your optimization. Now, I can give you a paper about it and discuss it further afterwards. You can also talk to Rickard, who's a mathematician. You can explain it with diagrams and equations, if you like.
Well, I bring it up there. We're out of time, but please join me in thanking Professor